Through rapid change. We are so excited that you're here with us today, and I'm here with some of my wonderful educators too. We're going to be talking about how do you lead through Texas change, and we'll start with who we are today. I'm Linda Gale Walker. I've been an educator over 30 years. I have done lots of work in trauma, and wrote a book actually called Surviving the Storm: How You Lead Through Post-Traumatic Growth. Because not just since the pandemic, but just what we're living with has been really difficult. And one of the ways I got into trauma was actually I am the executive director of a nonprofit that serves abused and neglected children. I've been doing that for 26 years. So being able to look at trauma-informed leadership and trauma-informed design is kind of where my worlds collided. And I'm joined today with my friend Brandy Baker.
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, Brandy Baker. I'm looking at 26 years as an educator and practitioner. I've held many roles as teacher, high school principal, chief academic officer, and now I proudly serve as the chief of staff for Pflugerville ISD.
And Becky.
Hi, I'm Becky Stovall. I'm a previous middle and high school teacher and principal, university level, and then authored a couple books and glad to be with you all today. I'm also going to be manning the chat box, so if you have comments or questions, feel free to throw those in there and we'll have some discussions in the chat.
Yes, we want to hear from you. Well, the first thing I'll just tell you the three things we're really going to be talking about today. The first one is understanding trauma in the Texas context. We'll visit a little bit about some of the special challenges we seem to be facing, building pro-social communities through connection, and how do we creating catalysts for healing and connection. So we're going to start out today, and I hope we have a lot of educators on the call today. Glad to see you here. But I want to first of all talk about what is trauma. And I know a lot of you've done a lot of things probably with trauma in your district, but I just want to kind of remind you if you're not, used to it. One of the things that we talk a lot about is things like food insecurity, and we've looked at a lot of research. That is a really big problem we're facing here. Even though we seem to be doing a much better job than we were 20 years ago with that with kids, a lot of those things have happened. And I also do want to take just a minute and pause. We've had lots of natural disasters in Texas. One very recently down in the hill country Pflugerville area, that has just been really devastating, and it will devastate lots of families. A lot of people had connections to the camps down there, and the devastation has just been really hard to deal with. We have a lot of natural disasters. We've seen them tornadoes in the Panhandle, all the way to hurricanes coming up and off the coast. So we have a little specialty thing that we think about that in Texas is we get a lot of those things, and we really want to be sensitive today to understanding that happens. But I want to talk a little bit about the types of trauma that we talk about sometimes it's acute trauma, a one-time event. It could be a car crash, a house fire, even a storm. And then we're going to talk a little bit about chronic trauma. How do you have that long term? What happens when you have long term exposure to stress? That could be the abuse, the instability in the household, housing insecurity, food insecurity. That's a chronic trauma that actually we'll talk about a little bit too, that a lot of our kids face. And then another piece we have that I think is really important to point out is complex trauma. That's layered traumas over time. I have worked in the same area long time, and you see generational trauma. And I know a lot of you, Brandy and Becky too, you've been in the education business for a long time. You see generational trauma, and that is something that's difficult. We see that a lot of times in foster care, multi-generational hardship. One of the things that I've done a lot of research in lately over is trafficking. We see so many of our students and talks about how trafficking is really such a double-edged sword with trauma because a lot of times the people that are trafficking the people are either related or boyfriends or girlfriends or have some sort of significant relationship, and that complex trauma really does make a difference. But one of the things I think at the bottom is so important to me, we know in Texas that every child's story matters, and with care, connection, and community, we can really help heal. And we also one of the things we're going to visit about a little bit today too is sometimes we don't necessarily know all of the traumas that we're going to have because of things like they have to be self-reported or in the border. So let's go look at this next slide here. This is why it matters. When I talk about why it matters, if you look over here on the left slide, you're going to see the 10 total ACEs that we talk about. ACEs, if you're not aware, are reverse childhood experiences. And one of the things that's so important to me when we start thinking about those is I was doing actually a presentation for a group of school leaders. And the principal in the building actually got up and walked out. And I was like, "Oh gosh, is everything okay? I hope I didn't offend you." And he said, "I looked up there and my kids have 4 of those." So it's not immune to other people. It's all of us that have had these type of traumas. And so when we look at these, why does it matter? Well, the first thing is when you have these adverse childhood experiences, just a second ago we talked about the chronic trauma. It can actually disrupt your neurodevelopment so you don't react the same way. One thing that I think we've seen with that is kids that don't have the actually appropriate social reaction when something happens. Then it can have social and emotional and cognitive impairment, adoption of health at risk behaviors, disease, disability, and social problems, and early death. We are seeing such. I started with this job at the executive director for the abuse neglect in our town. We had 33 kids, and the largest city in our town is small. It's 24,000 people. We run about 212 now. And a big reason is that because of drugs. So rural communities aren't exempt from this, urban communities aren't exempt from this. And what we see is self-medication or drug use problems and substance use problems that leads to that early death. So Brandy, can you tell me a little bit, does any of this stand out to you, or what are you seeing in your schools?
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of it stands out to me, Linda Gell. So we in Pflugerville, we see all categories of the ACEs, and ranging anywhere from the parental separation to the substance abuse that you just mentioned, to neglect and food security. I would say over probably the past 6 to 7 months, what's really standing out for us right now in our schools is the emotional impacts of incarcerations that have been increasing due to just some adjustments in the political environment that we're all experiencing. Unstable housing has become more and more unaffordable for a lot of our families in the region in which I live, and that chronic stress, again, just due to that economic hardship. And so these traumas, they show up in all of our classrooms. I'm sure they're showing up across millions of classrooms in the United States every day, and they're affecting not only the academic outcome of our students, but also the emotional and behavioral well-being of our students and our staff.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it goes back into schools. We've always known about it, right? We've been talking about kids that had trauma, but being able to see it now really firsthand, and how the impact of all of that part of school makes a difference to them too. Well, let's look a little bit too. This is I think Becky, you were going to tell us about this.
Yeah, when we think about who's in a classroom, the Texas Education Agency has taken a look at your typical 24 students that are in the classroom. You can expect 4 of those students that are struggling with mental health challenges that might even impact their day-to-day functioning. Half the class, that's 12 students, have experienced at least one traumatic event, and 10% of the class have endured 3 or more traumatic experiences. These numbers aren't just statistics, they're reminders of that invisible load that many of the students carry with them every day. And as teachers and as educators, we have to think about the systems and the supports and the classrooms and making sure they're designed with these realities in mind. What are your thoughts, Brandy
Well,
or Linda Gale?
I think it's surprising to me a little bit, because to me, I would think these numbers might be higher. I looked nationally, and they're talking now nationally. They think at least half the classes are probably going to have that happen. But I'm wondering too, one of the things I've noticed working with CPS is there's so many different kinds of reporting. So now CPS does investigations in family based, and another agencies are starting to do foster care. And then a lot of this is based on self reporting, and a lot of kids just know, especially older kids, know not to say anything. So I don't know, Brandy, what about you?
One of the things in a shift in our thinking this year, or I guess last academic year, we actually did a thought exchange to better understand what was preventing our students from attending school regularly. And going in, before seeing that data, had some predictions of what it might have been, but was very surprised. Actually, our students and our parents reported to us that mental health issues that was the number one thing keeping our kids from attending school regularly. And so I, as a practitioner, am starting to shift and think about all aspects of school differently. And so it was nice to see this because it did validate some of the things that we're seeing in our district as it relates to the mental health of our students and staff.
I think that's so key too, Brandy, because one of the things when you talk about that with mental health, that used to be, even with kids with ADHD, parents were so hesitant to tell the school anything like that. So I think that says a lot about the trust you built in your district, I think, but also how these kids really do need help. And we've got to consider that before it really impacts all of our schools and our work. One of the things I heard the other day, I was actually watching TV and this person was talking about the war outside the window that our kids face. And I was like, okay, that is fascinating. And he went on to talk and he talked about how that what kids face outside really impacts us so much on the inside. And I was thinking back to my days as an administrator, and I will never forget a little girl in my class, and she was kind of quiet, but she was very sweet and really a good girl. And I didn't know, I hate to say this, I didn't know a ton about her home life because usually I knew the ones that parents were in my room all the time or in my office all the time, or the ones that, I was trying to call CPS on. So this was I didn't have any kind of alert on this little girl besides she was just really sweet. And so one day, it was the day before, of course, this is old, it's a tax test. But she came in and she was late and she looked like she was about to cry. And she's like, Miss Walker, I'm here. And I was like, okay, well, we're getting ready to start. I mean, the test. So I'm looking at her, I'm like, okay, are you okay? She obviously was not. And I said, okay, honey, let's talk for just a second. So I just pulled her aside and I said, what's going on? She goes, well, listen, the police came and raided our house last night and they took my dad and my mom, but I hid in the closet. They'd done a drug bust. And I was like cold chills down me going, oh my gosh, and you got up and came to school. She's like, I just hid in the closet. And I thought, well, number one, how did you stay quiet? Because that wasn't the first time that had happened or she didn't know. So she'd been taught to hide. And the second thing was her first thought, instead of being sad that her dad and mom were gone, or go to somewhere else, was to get up and get ready to come to school because she knew we'd made such a big deal about how important the test was, just to be honest, which made me feel about this big. But it really was one of those things, that just kind of impacted me to talk about, think about all these things kids go through and what are some of the traumatic experiences we've seen, in our communities and how that's impacted and what our children experiences. So, I want you to think for just a second, if you're on the chat or if you're listening to this, I want you to think for a second, what about the war outside your window? Like a lot of times, there's a lot of places that we see that. And so, Brandy, I'm going to ask you first, what is your experience with this been?
Yeah, first of all, I love that question and just the framing, the war outside of the window. And so for Pflugerville, I've been in Pflugerville. I've lived here for 20 years, and the story that you shared it was a powerful reminder of what many of our students are trying to navigate behind the scenes. And over the past 20 years, our our community has changed dramatically. Texas has changed with the growth and people moving in. And so in Pflugerville, we too are witnessing a significant shift from a predominantly suburban district, fast growth suburban district, to one that is being increasingly shaped by the dynamics of Austin because we're so close to Austin. And so we're starting, we've been experiencing that urban sprawl and some of those challenges that come with it. And with that shift, we're also seeing a growing number of newcomers to our district and students and families that who are not only adjusting to a new culture and a new language, but they're also carrying trauma of that migration, the instability, or that displacement. And so that's a real lived experience for us. And these realities, these experiences, they show up in our classroom in very complex ways through behavior, through academic struggles, through emotional withdrawal. And so for us, it reinforces the importance of trauma-informed practices, culturally responsive teaching, and the need for strong and trusting relationships. And I know, Lindigo, you often talk a lot about trust and just the changes that we've seen in Pflugerville, that concept, that relational aspect of trust has become so important for us to make sure that we're maintaining that with not only our students, but with our families. And so that's the war outside of our window right now.
And it really is so important. And like I said, I think, Brandy, that schools have got to start thinking that way. And one of the ways that that I look at it that way too. Hold on just a second. Found a little glitch in my. I'm not gonna believe I had a technology error, but there it was. Okay. But one of the things we talk about a lot is it affects us in schools. And I know as staff members, I work with leaders and teachers all over the place. I know you do too. And there's such pressure for performance. That's just the best way to say that. There's such pressure for performance that sometimes it can really it be a struggle to how do I balance those things. And this is one of the reasons I think it's important to think about that. The first one is when you have this trauma, and kids are always thinking that way, they have reduced cognitive capacity. I mean, you're just in survival brain and you can't really think deeply when you're in that. It's just absolutely the science behind it. The other thing I notice is sleep disturbances. I go through a lot of schools and I cannot tell you, I know so many people talk about the hoodie over their head, right? The kids sleeping with the hoodie on their head. But when you start thinking about that with the sleep disturbances a lot of these kids have, they're exhausted when they're coming. And we also know that's difficult on our academics, having difficulties with memory. And not being able to impact those retrieval skills, and then also language delays. I remember I was a reading specialist when I was at school, college, and I remember thinking and learning how important vocabulary was. So when had kids on my own, we were always talking, using words, those kinds of things. But now with the way we have also, so much stuff is on social media or on our devices, that not being able to hear that language delays, that really is going to impact success in the long run for our kids. And then Becky, I think were you going to talk a little bit about the other impacts on social relationships?
I think Brandy might have some comments on that.
Um, Linda Gale, can you just redirect me here?
Well, I
Sorry.
can, and I'm so
Okay.
sorry. I think that was my problem. When we talk about the impact on social relationships, we're talking about the kids have a need for control.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that's one of the things that I think was so critical is I see a lot of times with discipline. I'm going to pull this in with social relationships and behaviors. Kids that have that need for control, and then we go in and shift things on them, it's really difficult for them to let that go or to be part of, like, if I'm going to be part of a group, that need for control can be difficult. So that's an impact on social relationships. Poor peer relationships is another outcome of that we see. And also this unstable living condition. I work with a couple of schools here lately, and one of the things they have put in, which I think is actually kind of genius, and sad too, is they've put in washing machines in their campuses, and they go in and they have extra sets of clothes for kids that come in with the smell of pot reeks on them and those kinds of things, or they've lived in the same clothes for a week. A lot of them are putting in clothes closets, and that's just something that I see. Is that mirror kind of what y'all are seeing as well?
Yeah, we definitely are experiencing everything that you just mentioned. One of the things that we do notice and we are noticing is that sometimes those students feel like they have no control. And so anytime that they can insert themselves and take control of a situation, that they will do it. And so our teachers have done a really good job of, that voice and choice in the classroom and providing those options for our students. But one of the things that I've noticed is that when a student feels like they don't have control, and again, control is defined, differently for everyone, but when they don't have a control, whether it's to be what book they want to read, where they want to sit, how do they, want to show up in that classroom, what we've noticed recently over probably the past 5 years, the student behavior has really taken the forefront. And there's a lot of outburst, there's a lot of aggression, there's a lot of resistancy. And so all of that, impacts the student's ability to collaborate, to show up, to just be open to receiving, whether it's a relationship, um, exchange or an academic exchange, there's just a resistancy, to engage. And it's just because that control is just not there. It's just not
And
there.
and that's so true, and I think that leads to the next piece too is, we know that it matters because it affects performance negatively, and it increases response time. That's another thing when you talk about that with control and teachers, a lot of those kids do not want to answer. I call it you talked about voice and choice, and you talked about the deer in the headlights look, right? So if you a lot of times ask kids a question we have a lot of trauma, they'll look at you deer in the headlights because no choice that they've made it's been met with the same response a lot of times. So, I may do this 5 times and the 10th time I may get, hit beaten for that, or I don't go to have any dinner or this or that. So they don't have that stability, which leads to distrust. But I also think another thing is giving them low risk, high reward voice and choice things to build that trust that when you pick we're going to talk a little bit about some seating options today on some things, but like if you pick a chair, it doesn't matter to me what chair it is. It just matters that I'm getting to pick it and where I want to sit matters. And it gives them control. And then it also gives them trust that now I can say where I want to sit. I keep going back to when my kids were little. I would put 2 outfits out and say, which choice do you want? And I was fine with either one. But a lot of these kids just haven't been met with that. And that kind of escalates distrust. So that's another thing with teachers, I think being very cognizant of response time will matter and allowing kids time to prep will matter to build some of that trust that, you're okay however long it takes. We're going to work with that and knowing that at the end that outcome will come. Um, and so, Brandy, I would just want to ask you a little bit. I know you and I've talked about this with students on and on about how important that piece is, but also staff and other members of your school community. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Do you see these effects with the school community and staff as well as the students?
Absolutely. Exactly what you have on this slide is exactly what we're seeing here in Pflugerville. And we've had students who we have students. They come back to school next week, so we're looking forward to inviting them back.
Yay!
But I know it's very exciting. So we have students who are incredibly bright, but when they are triggered or overwhelmed by whatever that war outside of the window is for them, their ability to process and respond, you're absolutely right. They shut down, they freeze. They're that deer in the headlight. And you'll ask them a question, they freeze, and not because they don't know, because they do. It's just because that their nervous system at that point is just it's on overdrive. And so that distrust piece again that you have mentioned, it is there, and especially for our newcomers. I remember a staff member of our newcomer center telling us that they had that we had a new student enroll, and last year we had over 250 newcomers enroll new to our district last year. And one particular student just completely shut down and froze when they heard sirens going off, right? Just a typical fire truck, probably police, ambulance, or something minor, but they completely froze. And the staff member had reported to me that it actually took weeks of consistent, calm support before that student would even make eye contact and start to engage with the teachers and their peers. And that just shows you how deeply trauma can shape the way that students interact with adults and in school in general. And it, as it relates to our staff, yes, we're seeing the same thing with our staff too. When you're working with students who are carrying trauma every day, it starts to wear on you. There's a carrying capacity for all of us here, and that's why we support our educators and our staff. And not just our students, and we just don't use strategies, but we do it with space, how the space that welcomes them, whether it's their office building, whether it's their classroom, whether it's their lunchroom, their teacher lounge, we do it with space and we do it with care. And at the end of the day, if we want high expectations to be realistic, we have to meet our students and our staff where they are. And in Pflugerville, we believe that trauma-informed practices aren't about lowering the bar, but it's about clearing the path for them.
I completely agree with that. And I think a good thing that you've done at your district is y'all aren't new to the game of trauma-informed practice. And I think that makes a key difference, but you're still always constantly building that trust. So I know a lot of times, it became a thing. Everybody knows some about trauma, but how do I actually implement it? Like you said, in spaces, and it's not just strategies. And one of the things, I love this next slide here, and I just want y'all to read it really quick while I kind of go through and look. But when we talk about this, it says, you only understand about every third word that is said to you. You have a hard time sleeping and you can't regulate your emotions. Sometimes you have outbursts about the tiniest things, and at other times, just to keep away from the stress and the anxiety in your head, you emotionally detach and become indifferent. And it's not because you're a bad parent or a stupid person. I think this really hit me, because there has been times that I've worked with some groups, and it's like I'm talking, but they're not really understanding what I say, and I think that kind of hits us all. And Brandy, you and I were just talking about that happened to you not long ago.
Yes. So, in my life, I know I've had many traumatic experiences. But it wasn't until one of the recent ice storms here in Central Texas, where I think at that point I just had the context and the lens to experience and interpret my life a little differently. And so during one of the ice storms here in Central Texas, I actually went 4 days without water and power. And it was basically like Little House on the Prairie, but with a cell phone. Like that's the life I was living. And even though our students were at home, school operations didn't stop. I don't have summers off, and I definitely don't have snow days. I wish I wish I got those,
Especially
but
in
we
Austin.
no, no, no. Even when school's called off, I promise you there's a group of people who are still working behind the scenes to make sure that that district is ready to open when school is ready to open. And so we still had meetings every day. And so I found myself, I was sitting in my car, wrapped in a blanket, my phone plugged in so I could charge it. And I was just trying to stay warm, and most importantly, trying to stay professional, because I was, I still had to work. And um, I found myself just, nodding along in the meetings, but in my head, I was just thinking, first, I wish I was warm. Two, I wish I could, take a shower, and that I was only hoping for some Wi-Fi so I could figure out what was going on, in the world around me, because I had no way to figure that out. And eventually, I had to be honest with my boss, which was very difficult to tell your superintendent, like, hey, we need to rethink this. But I finally worked up enough nerve, probably on day 2 or 3. And I told my boss that while I appreciated the commitment to serving our families, that many of us were just trying to survive too, because at that time they still had power and water. Right? Their life was still normal. It was just a little
Yep,
colder
yep.
for them.
Still going, but
And
cold. Yes, yes.
yeah, still going, but cold. And so at that point, running the district really felt like a second priority. And I just wanted to make it through the storm. And so at that moment, it really hit hard for me as an adult. And that's, I think, just my life experiences allowed me to pause for a minute and really reflect on what I had just experienced, because I'm an adult, and even I couldn't fully function. I couldn't function during that ice storm. I couldn't stay focused. I couldn't function. And it gave me a real personal understanding of what our students experience when they're dealing with trauma. If I couldn't handle a simple phone call meeting without heat and water, I it was very hard for me to imagine, how hard it must be for a child to focus on math when their world really feels like it's falling apart. And sometimes survival has to become or come before standards. And that was a pivotal moment for me, and as an adult, understanding the true impact of trauma.
Well, and I think that's so key too, and it kind of leads us to our next slide is the lens of trauma. Like you said, if you haven't experienced it, sometimes it's really difficult to see how it can affect you. And when we look at these things here, one of the things I wanted to point out, that I think is really important is the protective responses of adults involved in the child's life or lack thereof is really a key indicator of the lens of trauma. And one other thing I think that's a key to point out is we kind of had a, during COVID, it was a little bit difficult because we kind of had that kind of stunted time in our school. And when we start thinking about kids, when they start looking now, we always done ACEs from 18 and below. And it's like, okay, these are adverse childhood experiences. But they're talking now, even young adults from 25 to 30 are starting to have some of those impact from those experiences as well. And the reason I point that out is because that's the age of a lot of our teachers. So it's not, again, going back to that, it's not just kids, it's staff. So Brandy, I was just going to ask you a little bit when we talk about these bullets here. Can you kind of tell me a little bit about what resonates with you and why that's important to understand?
I think, Linda Gell, for me, it's that last bullet. That last bullet really resonates with me. As an educator, in schools, regardless if if we signed up or not, we are often that last safety net for many of our students and our families. And so when students don't have a consistent supportive adult at home, we're not just teaching math and reading, we're actually helping them to regulate, to trust, and to feel safe. And that's beyond the literacy, beyond the science, it's beyond the math, but that's what we're charged to do. And while and honestly, that's been our work at Pflugerville over probably the past 6 years around trauma informed and restorative practices, and it's become important here. That's the lens in which we start all of our work, and it isn't new for us. It's been going on for years. We've been offering professional development around trauma informed practices, restorative practices, just so that our team and even our board, like our board of trustees has gone through this training too, just so that we can understand trauma, that we can build that safety, the supportive and positive relationships and those learning environments. And it's important, and we're applying it with our adults as well. So that last bullet really resonates with me.
Well, and it does with me as well. And we start thinking about this, it gets a little depressing. And so that's one of the things I wanted to show you. I want you to look at Marguerite Johnson, and I want you to kind of look at this. And if I looked at Marguerite's information here, one of the things I would just be like, this is going to be really early death. Like this is some hard things. And I want to show you what ended up happening with her. It does matter who our people are. One of the things when you listen to her story that's so impressive to me is she had a grandmother who made a huge impact and difference in her life. And so it's not hopeless. I think sometimes we look at a kid's ACEs, and I mean, I've been guilty of, I don't, my husband and I are talking about a family friend who their children have been through a lot of things. And I said, it's just hard to think what their life will be. But then you go back to think of the importance of adults in those. And I think that tells you connection matters more than ever before. And we really need to talk about how schools can change that trajectory. Because when you think about it, and I'm going to say, especially with the advent of devices, I remember sitting at my grandmother's feet shelling peas, and we would talk and shell peas. I know that's if you're not from, so if you don't know, some of y'all may not know what I'm talking about if you're younger, but we would sit and snap and shell peas. And it would be conversations we would have. And now I go to dinner, and so many kids not talking. So being able to make those connections really in person is really important to me. And so when we talk about schools and how much time kids spend there, Brandy, like what do you see as challenges that schools might face in spending time from developing these connections, and how could they help change that?
Well, first and foremost, and something, Linda Gell, that you've always reiterated with me in all of our exchanges is that connections, they matter. They really, really matter. And but I think one of the biggest challenges that school face, that we're facing, is time. With so many demands on our teachers and our staff, building relationships feels like it's something that's extra. And the truth is that when we can focus on connection early, we can also prevent issues that we may have as it could relate to behavior or even disengagement, right? We can prevent those. So, but time is a challenge. I think for me, the second thing I've identified as a potential challenge to connection is the mindset. We really have to help staff see that relationships, they're not separate from learning. Their foundation. It starts with that relationship. And then finally, I would say probably in the past 10 years, for me, that I've identified that can get in the way of connections, which I will tell you, this wasn't a natural connection for me, as you know, identifying how does this play or doesn't play, but it was the physical environment. That physical environment, it matters too. That classrooms that allow for movement, that allow for collaboration and conversation that naturally will support connection, those are important. And so in contrast, you know, over the past 26 years, unfortunately, I would say that I've seen a lot of classrooms that are very rigid, that are isolating or have isolating setups, and that can make it really hard to build relationships. So time, mindset, and the actual physical classroom setup can be challenging for making those connections.
Well, Brandy, this next thing I'm going to talk about, it really does connect with all the pieces that you're talking about. And when we talk about the trauma responses and behaviors and how that the actual things are set up, it can make a big difference for kids. And it helps us pick up on kids too. I am doing a lot of work in the Uvalde, getting the new school ready. And we have been talking a lot about that. And as sad as this is, I work across the nation now, and I've worked in 6 schools that have had school shootings. And so I've gone back in and checked and called, and it's really interesting to me how important it is for us to start picking up on things early. And we talk a lot about that. And one of the things, and I know you do this when you go visit your schools, the externalizer kids, the kids that react with fight or flight, you pick up on them pretty early. Like I'll know their names in the first 5 minutes I'm walking through, right? And you see all these behaviors here. We kind of call them their discipline problems. Um, and we understand that teachers are really good. Like this kid's got a lot of this is understanding, but who we're missing, I think, a little bit when you talk about if I'm sitting in a row and I'm not having conversations, are those kids that are internalizers. They have negative coping behaviors. They might look compliant, but they're not engaged. They have a lot of emotional dysregulation, and they do become the future school shooters. But also, I think something that we're really hitting here in Texas, when I look, is suicide. Suicide rates have just are skyrocketing, and we are seeing so much of that. And it's actually going, I always thought that was kind of a teenage problem. And when you start looking now, it's starting at 10. And so that is such a fast growing way that we've got to start thinking about this. School shootings are horrible, and we all are just heartbroken about that. And we've got to pick up on these kids. But even if you feel like, okay, we've got a physically safe space, we're all fine here. At the end of the day, the week I was in Uvalde and the week I found out about Uvalde, I was actually in another school, and they had a child commit suicide the next day. I'm just saying it's really affecting us, in lots of ways. And one of the ways we talk about that is our trauma responses. We talked about the discipline kids being the fight or flight. And we're used to those. They fight or they flee. But when we see these freeze and fawn behaviors, I mean, sometimes, especially the fawn behavior, those can really seem like a kid that's kind of with you, oh, they're really interested in what I have to say. But really and truly, that is their trauma response. So when you start getting deeper, it makes a big difference. Like I was in a classroom one time, and it was funny. The teacher had said, watch this little girl. When she gets anything somebody said to do, she was like, oh yeah, yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll do that. And you've seen that. You've seen people do that before, and they really fawn in that relationship and have a little trouble. I do want to point out something. We're going to talk next about pro-social, which I love, and I can't wait to talk to you about. But we also have students be too pro-social that have experienced trauma, because sometimes they're so used to being the parent that they have tried that pro-social behavior, and they have trouble even speaking for themselves. So when we talk about this kind of community we want to build, pro-social or antisocial, I think everybody would say at the end of the day, pro-social, of course. But when we talk about that, let's really look at what that is. Well, pro-social behavior is really an intentional action that benefits others. It is the opposite of antisocial, which harms relationships and disrupts social functioning. But it's also socially competent students are really typically pro-social. I was doing a lot of parenting reading too, and it talked about kids being able to get along with others. Details a lot of that with how pro-social they are. And I want to point out this because I think it's really important. I am pretty extroverted. I know you can't tell that. And I live with someone that's kind of introverted. Introverted's not antisocial. When you look at pro-social, it's not about the number of of interactions you have. It's really about the quality and not the quantity of that. So how are kids really reflecting on that? And I want to, as we're continue talking about this pro-social, looking at this list, I don't know really any schools that don't want this in their classroom, but a lot of times it's difficult to pick up on. Would you agree with that, Brandy?
Absolutely. I think you're right. I don't think there's anything on here that as an administrator or as a teacher, I wouldn't want to walk into a classroom and be able to either see, feel, or hear.
Yes. And I think we have kind of our classroom set up right now as individual survival. Like, let's get in here, we've got to do good. Everybody's on a leveled kind of reader or plane or, something they're doing. And we sometimes just or so, and I will tell you this even as a college professor, I was very worried about the individualized education of each child. And I think as teachers, we have that mindset, like, I want you all to do well. And if you're not doing well, I want to come together. And it was a control thing for me a little bit too. I wanted to control that I was trying to help you and getting the right information. But one of the things we talk about with pro-social is sometimes it's collective thriving and belonging and how that really comes about. And I think when we think about that, one of the ways that we talk about that is their thoughtful interactions and behaviors. When I think about kids, and this always leads me to you, Brandy, you for a long time have thought about this with kids working together. When we think about those thoughtful behaviors and interactions, you have to have a process of that. It's really difficult if, like you said, I want control, I'm going to run this group. And a lot of your kids don't like group work because of that. I didn't really love it either when I was a kid. So do you see these thoughtful interactions and behaviors? I know y'all do a lot of teamwork type of things. Are these behaviors that you think have naturally recurred through your restorative work, or do you think that this is something that maybe is a little bit different than that?
I think some of these naturally occur. And I also believe that based on the war outside of the window, we have to intentionally teach these skills and we need to be intentional about creating them. So I would say it's a combination. There's some natural that will happen, but also I think systems have to be intentional on making sure that these skills can be taught and practiced.
I completely agree with that. And that's one of the things too, when I think about, as you talked about the room setup, is what are kids doing that more naturally lends to this authentic experience? And that makes them more engaging. And when we look at these, one of the things that really hit me on these tasks were the trauma responses and behaviors. It's very important to pick up on students earlier. So if I'm sitting there and I'm doing a task with 4 kids, and we're talking about the internalizer, and that child's not being able to work in that group, if I don't ever see them try to work in a group, I'm not able to pick up on them. So I think that is a really key point of this, is being sure that none of these kids can slip through the radar, and use those pieces. And when we talk about this pro-social learning piece too, it's really interactive. It's how you think about things. And it talks about how these kids sit in groups and how they develop the social connections, acceptance of team members, caring and kind, helpful behaviors. Brandy, can you give me, because I know you've done a lot of this work, can you give me an example of how you feel like this has worked with y'all doing the restorative classroom work, and then also having your environment support that?
Yeah, so our focus in Pflugerville has been about building a culture where students feel safe, they feel connected, and they feel supported. And so restorative practices has really allowed us to do that by creating spaces for students to build those relationships, to reflect on their actions, and if needed, to repair harm. So we use things like morning check-ins, we use community circles, restorative chats, just to help students to feel seen and heard, to give them some control. And it's not just about what's happening after something goes wrong too. A lot of people think, restorative practices is just about repairing. It's not. Actually, there's a large preventative piece for that. And so it's about allowing us to build strong relationships every day, that students feel like they belong in our schools and they belong in our classrooms. And classrooms specifically, that setup has to support trauma-informed practices. It has to support restorative practices. So when students are able to sit in teams or small groups, it gives them more of a chance to talk, to listen, and to work together. And I think that naturally encourages that kind of connection and empathy that we're trying to build through our restorative work.
No, I completely agree with that. And I want to share a little bit about, I'm sorry, the research on pro-social, and I'm gonna go through this pretty fast because we're gonna share this with you if you're watching our webinar today. But I think one of the main things, Brandy, I want to talk to you a little bit about too. A lot of this is about Maslow's hierarchy. And when we talk about Maslow and what kids need, a lot of these things with pro-social are kind of what the students need. And we look at these pieces all together, and we talk about this kind of disengagement level and how kids have that fundamental disconnect sometimes with our devices and pieces like that. So when we talk about this creating space for the healing and change, I want us to just kind of share just a little bit about this catalyst for healing and connection. So when we look at this and we talk about this, the pro-social classroom and how it can impact the stage on that, Brandy, can you share a little bit with me about what you kind of think about that quote?
Yeah, so I really do believe that the environment can make or break instruction, connections, or belonging. And I've learned, unfortunately, I've learned that the hard way. Everything I've learned through a lesson. And so many years ago, our district took on project-based learning, and we checked all of the boxes. We had the top tier professional development. We provided all the resources to our principals and teachers. We had queuing systems. We had celebrations. Everything textbook as it related to change or transition management, we did it. And if there was a checklist for how to do it right, again, we did it. But it was probably 2.5, 3 years into it, we were still scratching our heads and asking ourselves, like, why isn't PBL taking off, right? Like, we are 2 to 3 years later, and why isn't this working? And so I think as any good leader, you go and you see the work. And so that's exactly what I did. I went into the campuses, I went into the classrooms myself. And what I saw was kind of like trying to run a group project at a DMV, right? Kids were sitting in rows, they were facing forward, they were barely making eye contact, and we were all asking them to collaborate and create, right? PBL is about generating knowledge. The furniture and the outlay of the room, it was completely getting in the way of everything that we were trying to build. So purposeful talk wasn't happening, peer interactions, they were awkward. And for our emergent bilingual students, it took away those natural opportunities for them to listen, speak, and process language through interaction. The furniture in the classroom setup was stopping, it was stopping that. It was a hard realization because as leaders, we're not taught to look at the classroom setup. We're taught to look at the curriculum, to look at the assessments, to look at the instruction. And so that's when it really started clicking for me that the environment just wasn't a backdrop to learning. It had to be part of the instruction itself. And if the space doesn't support connection, it doesn't support collaboration or movement, it's going to block everything that we're trying to do.
And it's funny, Brandy, one of the things that hits me when you talk about that too is what we do a lot, Becky and I do, is talking about aligning your mission and vision of what you want instruction in your like portrait of a graduate, how you want all those things to do, and what experiences you want kids to have, and then how the environment needs to look. And it never hit me until we did a campus, and we had done an equity. It was a kind of restoring some of their older buildings, but putting in some new spaces. And I will never forget, a kid walked up and he was like, "Hey man, I don't go to the ghetto school anymore." And I was like, I don't think about that as making a kid feel different. I guess I really never had looked at it that way, as far as this does make me feel different with equity. And it really was shocking because he still was in the building, the same building he'd had, but it had new pieces in it. And it was just amazing, the difference in his lifestyle and how he felt about that. And I think that has been a key piece with all of this. And one of the things we talked about pro-social, we looked at those things, but I want to show you this environment too. When we look at this, and Pro-social goes all the way up to, college, actually. In fact, when I was a professor, I remember setting my room up differently, and I got in trouble because I forgot to change it back into rows the next day because I just found like we did so much better. But when we look at these, one of the things I want to point out is kids being able to sit eye to eye, knee to knee. We talked about that a lot, and at first, I mean, it sounds like a little cliche thing, but it's so important with being able to read social cues. That's some of the research pro-social did. They call them pro-social and active learning classrooms. So kids were better able to pick up on social cues. If you notice here, there's a lot of choice in things. My favorite thing, I think, if you had to ask me of one piece that I would always do, it's the teacher. And I know you agree with this too, the teacher workstation where the teacher's got a little ability to be mobile, but have some things. So there's a lot of these kind of things that we look at and think about. But this same environment can be set up a lot of different ways. This is set up more for small group instruction. You mentioned the border when we talk about our English language learners. I was in a district that had very heavy and lots of different kinds of languages. And they had a kid come in right from another country. And the teacher said, but I think they know English. They're doing very, very well. And so I was watching them in the group of 4 when I was doing my rounds, and I looked, and this kid, somebody would say something, and the kid would be like, "Oh, yeah," very appropriately, or "No." And I was sitting there watching, and I thought, they're just mimicking the kid across from them. Like, they didn't really understand the language. So another thing we talk about is different group sizes make a difference. And second, groups of 2 make a difference, and groups of 4s make a difference. And when do we put those things together? That can make a big difference for us too. Um, I know when we look at this too, it can be a little bit daunting, but pro-social, if you think about how are some kids getting to stand or some kids getting to sit, those kinds of things too make a big difference for kids. And it just helps with that dynamic ergonomics. We also have here a piece of a science lab. You and I talked, Brandy, just about this a little bit a while ago. Content is important, especially when you start going middle school, high school. And what does it look like? And one of the things I think that's really cool, like even in the science lab, though there's lots of equipment, all of the pieces here are very intentional. And one of the things I want to point out is there's so many materials you need in the science lab that these having the storage around each table makes a huge difference because kids aren't traipsing, you've seen those kids. Like, I don't know exactly, my trauma response is to flight. So I'm going to go across the room and sharpen my pencil or go pick up another piece of material. And so having it close there too can help with that piece a little bit as well. We also talked about cafeteria spaces, and Brandy, I want to ask you a question about this with the cafeteria spaces. Do you notice a lot when you're in your schools too that kids are struggling more and more with that, call them dysregulated spaces, kind of where they don't have the systems and structures maybe as tightly in place as in classrooms?
Absolutely. And that's why I think, again, you mentioned intentionality. That has to show up in every space in your building, down to your cafeteria, your classroom. And so, yes, we do see students who are struggling in those dysregulated spaces. And so, our practices, our wayfinding, our cueing with the setup is equally important in those spaces as well.
And I think going back to our introvert versus extrovert conversation, to being able to have seating for kids where they have some options, especially in the secondary level, I think make a really big difference too, and in those kinds of pieces. And then we're looking at outdoor learning. I think now, so I will tell you, I live in windy West Texas, and so our outdoor learning, I laugh, I'm like, we use lots of sand to keep it down from the wind, but do y'all have any experience, either one of you, about the outdoor learning spaces and how that might work?
I've seen a lot of schools embrace courtyards and using those for learning, like gallery walks and stations. And it really just makes the learning come alive when you see these students outside, rotating around, doing things outside. It just gives a vibrancy to the learning.
And I think I go back to that biophilic design. There's research around that biophilic design in nature. I mean, they're putting trees in hospitals and things like that. And I can remember even as a teacher making I was back again, I'm old, but I was back in the 3D bulletin board days of building the tree and all those kinds of things. But there really is something to that. And then I think another piece that we look at is these esports and gaming. And this is kind of a new territory for a lot of people. But Brandy, I wanted you should share your experience about that, if you didn't mind, about esports.
Yeah, so I know we're running short on time, so I'll make it brief. But my CTO, Chief Technology Officer, made me go to Six Flags to actually witness an esports competition. And I will tell you, I wasn't avoiding esports, but it definitely was not in our strategic plan. It is in our strategic plan now. I will tell you, we just want it. You can go online. It's in our strategic plan now. And here's what I'll say. Seeing esports in action, that flipped a switch for me. And it's just not about gaming. It's about teamwork. It's about leadership. It's about problem solving. And it's a direct line to the digital media, STEM, and tier or tech careers that we want, our students to be exposed to. And yes, it's a little louder than the chess club, but it is just as powerful. And so now I am all in, and hopefully maybe Linda, we can do another webinar on esports and its impact on the learning environment, but I'm all in.
It has really been an amazing thing to me because I was the same way. I was like, okay, like I tried to talk my kid out of playing video games all the time. And so it's been amazing to see actually the benefits of that as well. Well, I want to kind of wrap us up here for just a second with kind of talking about why we pulled all these things together. And when we talk about creating this connection and culture of caring, I think a very, very important thing to point out is the fact that pro-social, and I encourage you all to look this up. That is not a term Meteor made up. It's an actual psychology term. And they started finding out why. And so, for example, why in small towns, it seems like when there was a tragedy, people came together, and then they did a deal in New York, and somebody was getting attacked on the street, and everybody thought somebody else would call. And so they talked about what that kind of behavior is. It's really a pro-social behavior. And our kids that have had a lot of trauma, one of the things that's really difficult for them, besides, building trust, but it's also finding their place. And Brandy, you and I talked the other day about the word dignity, finding some dignity in their spot. And one of the things I truly believe is if we can start thinking about pro-social education in our classrooms, and as not one more thing, and I think that's always the thing we do, that not as one more thing, but as actually the core and the basis of how we want to balance these pieces. I think it's really, really important to look at what the benefits are to our kids with trauma, because they have not seen necessarily pro-social learning. And so when we look at these pieces of this pillars of the pro-social education, one of the things they talk about is de-escalating situations. That is something that most kids that have a lot of ACEs haven't seen. How do I strengthen relationships? How do I see discipline as a teaching moment? I know when we visited about restorative practices, Brandy, how important to your district that was, because y'all did put a lot of time and energy into that. Have you seen a big benefit with that?
Absolutely. Our attendance has gone up. We do satisfaction surveys, climate surveys with our students. Their feedback to us has gone up. Our discipline rates have decreased. But most importantly, our teachers' job satisfaction has increased.
And that says everything. It really does. That says everything, because our teachers are our first line. Like you just said, that first line of defense. They really are. They're picking up on these kids. They're dealing with it. And I think that helps them have some tools to deal with that. The other thing we think about that is praise. And I mean, I'm going to talk about praise from our kids, but a lot of times just being able to hear that with each other. I know sometimes I can tell my kids they do great things, my own personal children, but someone else telling them that, especially a teammate or a colleague, or it's huge. I mean, it makes such an impact, and being able to be sure that it's not such a cutthroat competitive thing with everything in our classroom, that we're all trying to get to the top, but that we're all try to get to the top together. Thinking about it that way helps a lot. I think the teacher-student relationships is one of the very, very key pieces of the world. And we all know that there's some kids that are more difficult and more challenging than others, but I hope part of this webinar has helped you realize that a lot of times those behaviors you're seeing as a problem are behaviors that they are trying to deal with. And having a pro-social classroom I probably saw the best example. I was somewhere the other day, and one of the kids was starting to get upset, and a kid walked around and put their hand on their back, and there's like, "It's okay. You know, this is the time you need to do your breathing." And he walked right back to his seat. It didn't disrupt the class, but it was amazing to see that really was the teacher was fine with it. The teacher wasn't like, "Get back in your seat." They just had that built in with their relationships. And then I think what we talked about, the emotionally upbeat classroom, does the environment does matter. And I hope that's one of the things you got off of our webinar today. Brandy, I swear I could just talk to you for hours and hours and hours. And we are going to have to look at doing some more of these together. It's so much fun. And Becky, you're always a wealth of information too. Thank you all for attending today. If you have any questions or you want to know any more about how you can build some pro-social learning environments and how you can put all these pieces with leading trauma-informed schools together, please let us know. Have a great day.